now, good morning, happy Tuesday, PSW staff, clients, friends joining us. Now, I know for 2 years you've been wondering, when can we revisit Charles Ives? I know, it's taken me a long time because if you remember Charles Ives, very provocative composer. We're going to revisit his class today because we're going to be looking at maybe one of the first early American songwriters tomorrow. You know, America was a new country. 19th century, it's still a new country. But I want to show you Charles Ives. We're going to look at what he did, because a lot of dissonance, a lot of quotations from folk songs, American songs, and that's who the guy we're going to talk about tomorrow. That's what we're talking about. So let's look and revisit Charles Ives, get a good foundation of where his music came from, and then we'll talk at the end of the class, okay? Yes, American composer. I said American like that because he's important for many reasons. First of all, he changed American music and was maybe the most famous American composer, but didn't live to see any of that fame. He wasn't poor. He wasn't insecure about his work. He simply knew that he couldn't make money off of dissonance. What is dissonance? That's when something doesn't sound pleasant, exactly, right? This is consonance. That's dissonance. One's good, one's bad. So we're going to go through a timeline of his life. I'm going to tell you why he was so provocative, why his radical thinking. It's hard to say whether he was an angry... You know, it's interesting to think of artists, you know, what they're going through in their lives, and how that reflects, you know, how that reflects in their art, their personal lives. So we'll have so much fun so stay with me here. It's going to be a 4-hour class, but we're going to, just kidding. No, it's going to be fun. So Charles Ives, born 1874, and dies 79, lives a long life, dies of a stroke in 1954 in New York. So we got to get a timeline. This is who we're looking at. Now, I put Scott Joplin right there because, as we know, Scott Joplin is an American composer. We don't talk about American composers that much. I mean, I've done a class on John Adams, Steve Reich, you know, but those guys are still living. What about older American composers we haven't looked at? Mostly it's all been European, Western European composers. Wagner, Mozart, you know, those guys aren't American at all. So, but I did put Scott Joplin there because we have looked at him, and he was a little bit before with his, you know, ragtime and wonderful jazz-like music. You know, pre-jazz. Let's go over to Connecticut. Let's go and see his house in Danbury. Where he's from. His father taught him all about music. He was a trumpet. He was a horn player in the Civil War, actually, and taught him a lot about music, and would played in marching bands, and would influence him. Well, his son. I mean, he really taught him a lot about and we're going to look at some of these musical terms, because what made Charles Ives stand out was not just dissonance, and not just experimental music, but polytonality, polyrhythm. Poly means more than one, right? Mono is one, poly is more. So polyrhythm is more than one rhythm going on. That's not really... I bet you're being like, well, that doesn't sound like music. I mean, you don't want 4 different beats, time signatures going on, but he did. Polytonality, more than one key going on. You're probably cringing. Tone clusters that are dissonant, that are semitones apart, and aleatory. That's a term we haven't looked at. That's when the composer lets the performer make a choice on what fits the best, perhaps. So sort of giving them a little bit of freedom to improvise in some ways. His father's teaching him when he's 14. He becomes this great church organ player. But his father's doing little exercises with him where he's playing something on the piano, and mostly these are patriotic songs. Because if you think about it, this is like 1900, before 1900. So he's playing a song, and his father would do these little exercises where he would make Charles, the little boy, sing like "My Country 'Tis of Thee." And he would be playing the song in a different key. Or he'd be playing a different song, and Charles would have to keep in his key while the father was playing it at a different key. He would do all these little experiments that are really hard to do because you have to really focus on your line. So it wasn't harmony. It was completely different keys. So his father really taught him, I don't know for what purpose really, that music can be anything in a sense. And he played in a lot of marching bands. And Charles Ives would toy with this notion later of having different marching bands playing in different, if you think of a marching band, they play outside, right, for the most part. So if you had 2 or 3 marching bands playing outside and they came together, what would that music sound like? He was into these kind of ideas. So he goes to Yale, and he gets a very classical, strict European education in composition, counterpoint, all that stuff. But here's what's different. Usually around that time, they would they would encourage you to be, they would tailor you to be a European composer. If you're in America, you're studying music, you're going to be studying European composers, Wagner, Schumann, Schubert, mostly mostly German composers. You're going to be tailored to sound like that because that's the height of classical music. Well, there wasn't really an American classical music, so bear with me. That's what he didn't like about his studies. Why aren't we there? Of course, America was still young. Of course, America had folk music because we were an early country, but I don't think he wanted to become a second, third rate, Wagner when he could, and so he didn't vibe well with that at Yale, and I think he wrote something very dissonant in his first symphony, I believe, and his professor said, "Don't ever show me that again." He was rebelling. He wanted to. So this is almost the first. He's almost the first classical American composer. When you think of it, that's amazing. That's really amazing. But how does he get there? See, I told you this is going to be my most highly rated class. How does he get there? Well, he does what most people do after college. He sells insurance. Yeah, he was a composer that wrote at night on the weekends and on vacations, and during the day he would work on Wall Street. And he was a highly successful insurance salesman. He could sell, anything to anybody. And he opened up a firm and made tons of money doing that. Meanwhile, writing at night, writing this very dissonant music. As you hearing this throughout the class, but not as a way to... He loved music. He loved music, traditional songs. He loved American songs. He loved the songs of Stephen Foster. He loved... That was American music. Those were... We didn't have really classical music, but he was like, yeah, until he came along. And he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put all these pieces... I'm going to use I'm going to quote these pieces. I'm going to quote hymn tunes. I'm going to quote traditional American hymns. I'm going to incorporate some of these melodies that you would hear at a marching band and a holiday parade, and fiddlers on a Saturday night playing outside. It was almost like that John Cage thing where anything can be music. So if you walk outside and you're in a town in New England, you hear somebody playing the violin up there. You hear a marching band over there. He's putting that stuff, he's incorporating that in the symphony. The symphony's his little family. He's saying, come on in, let me... And they're not improvising. They're reading the score. In fact, some pieces require 3 or 4 conductors. It sounds chaotic. Now, there's some beautiful tonal music going on, so it wasn't completely all dissonant. But what he was doing is so ahead of his time. I mean, I don't even know if people really do that now. I mean, and I think that's why Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, American composers, really championed his music and gave him some of his early performances. But from 1900 to 1920, he's writing these symphonies. He's writing and working on the train, going back and forth, and writing these things and quoting quoting hymns and rags. So I mean, and patriotic songs, because he loved that kind of music. So why not put it in his music? And most of the music wasn't really performed in his life. He got a few performances, but he was a little sick and he gave up writing. So he mostly went unknown and became canonized and after his death, unfortunately. I mean, you know, he made a lot of money in insurance and was a church-going, loyal husband, wrote lullabies on the piano. I mean, wrote all kinds of music. But when it came to his quote-unquote serious classical music, it was he was provocative. And I always liked that. And he came up with a question where he said, "Are my ears on wrong?" And I thought that was hilarious. I mean, are my ears on wrong? It goes to show you again that we talk about artists that look at the world differently, listen, hear the world differently. And somebody asked him, they said, "Mr. Ives, why don't you write music that people like to hear?" And he said, "I can't. I hear something different." That's a very simple answer. So sometimes we just hear something different. We see something different. People can say, "Why don't you, why don't you do this?" I can't. That's not me. Or I'm not even in the same universe as what you're talking about. I mean, it's such a simple answer to, it's not a stupid question. It's kind of a question like with Andrew Lloyd Webber. Hey, why can't you write the Phantom of the Opera again? I tried, I can't. Okay, well, Coppola, why can't you do The Godfather again? All these questions of that we do want to know from the artist. The artist can't tell us. They don't know why. Perhaps they don't want to. I mean, I know we're getting philosophical and off track here, but these are things to think about. Are my ears on wrong? Or my eyes not? I mean, people with vision, filmmakers and painters, are their eyes on are their sockets not right? Yeah, I mean, that's what makes life interesting. We're all different. We're all creative. We're not robots. We're not all, we pretty much, look the same. But I mean, inside our brain is all, it's wired differently. So something to think about. Charles Ives, genius of a man, way ahead of his time. So Charles Ives, I mean, one of the first, maybe the first American composer. That's crazy to think about. I mean, composers have been going on for years and years with hundreds of years, centuries, with Western classical music, going back to Monteverdi and before. But for America, who was the first composer there? Unbelievable that Charles Ives might have been a completely original thinker, that he took European influences, but became one of the first American composers. And not that long ago, too, in the 20th century. So, and it's interesting to think, are my ears on wrong? Yeah, I just love that. There's that great scene in Deconstructing Harry where they think that they're filming this actor and they think the camera's out of focus, when really the actor in reality is out of focus. Great metaphor for just, is there something wrong with us, or do we need to adjust to see the world, or do we need the world to adjust to see us? Just the same with our ears, You guys all have music in you, in your ears, and you hope that people like that music, but sometimes you can't do anything about it. You just have to write whatever you feel is right. And, just a real provocative, original thinker. I just like that. So I love Charles Ives. Not music that you want to put on a Saturday night. I don't listen to his music all the time, but you guys need to know about these composers and these thinkers. So tomorrow will be a lot of fun because we're going to look at a songwriter that Charles Ives quoted in his music and was very influenced by him. Okay, so hope you can get to sleep tonight. I know it'll be very exciting. Okay, have a great rest of the day and see you tomorrow.